Now, before we get into more of our question on the innocence of God, I want to take what you've said. If you'd pass the microphone to your right to David. David, you wrote a book entitled Rediscovering Paul. It's an excellent book on Paul. If y'all don't have it, there's a library right across the way that does. And you're welcome to read it, but you can't take it out. David would tell you just to buy a copy. David, Udo says something has been there forever. He says that in his faith as portrayed biblically, he finds an explanation for reality. What would Paul say to that?
Paul's a Jew. He's a Jew of the Second Temple period. He inherited a canon of books, authoritative law, prophets, and writings. And I think he would be operating with that same sort of idea, this binary view of reality. There's two things. There's God, and there's everything that's not God, which is the material world. And compared to these other religions that we've talked about, or you were alluding to, God is outside of material world. And so I think Paul would agree very much that what Udo has said here about creation, about the material world, material not being eternal, but God being the eternal one. In fact, in our translation of the Bible, we translated the divine name, the Yod, the He, the Vav, the He, the unspeakable, ineffable name of God, as the eternal, trying to get at something of what the name means. And he is the eternal one, and yet we are living in this material world where clearly corruption is at work, oppression is at work, death is at work, and this is not how it should be. And God is doing something, has been doing something about it since the beginning to repair the world, to kun olam, to repair the world and bring it into God's kingdom. So I think Paul would agree with that sort of basic construct. I like the way that Udo talks about this complaint, because we've all done it, right? We all feel it. At the most fundamental aspect of being human, we kvetch and we complain and we argue because we know that we're made for a better place, a better world.
All right, so Udo, back to you. David points out that there is corruption in the world, that the world is not always the beautiful place that it may seem where we are, and certainly you've seen parts of the world that are miserable, that are destitute, that are on a fatalistic path. Is this God's will?
Well, if you could start from the proposition that what is in its present form and our present experience as what ought to be, then you would have to say it is God's will. If building on this, on the first thing I said. Happily, Scripture tells us that there's been this dramatic, awful fragmentation, interruption, violation of what God had made and called good. And that is what Scripture addresses from the 3rd chapter of Genesis on for the whole rest of the book. That is the conflict that exists between what God had made, a metaphysical statement, there is a real world, an aesthetic statement, it was beautiful, and a moral statement, it was good. You know, that's what you have in each of the 6 days, more or less, of creation, however long they were. And then comes this interruption that God is upset about, frustrated with, eager to repair, rather than turn his back on and say, well, good riddance, now you've done it. What you have is a God who immediately runs out, I'll talk about it some more tomorrow night, runs out after Adam and says, where are you? Which is not a question indicating God's ignorance. It's rather a question to make Adam and Eve consider, realize in their whole life what a mess they have now made. and then encourages them and says, but it's not all lost, because I'm willing to reinvest more to get back to work in order to repair what is so precious to me, you as people, and the creation that's affected by your sin. And the whole rest of Scripture is this involvement of God and his calling for us to take our small part in it, in this tikkun olam, repairing the damage of a fallen world. So that is not according to what God had in mind. I don't know if I get into that more detail, because I'll talk about it tomorrow night. Because we need to distinguish between what is in God's mind. He who knows the end from the beginning, his knowledge is all-encompassing. But contrary to the Greek understanding of knowledge, the God of the Bible knows things, so to speak, intellectually, which don't necessarily confirm or come out of his wishfulness or what he had intended to do. He knows evil without knowing it experientially. There's a real distinction there. The Greek gods, whatever they knew, had to also become real, or had to be real, not for the God of the Bible. And so what you have is now, after the fall, a world that no longer corresponds to what God had in mind, and in which God reinvests or invests a further activity, what I call the work of the eighth day, in order to undo the damage as long as it takes, with all the effort it requires, including the separation of the second person of the Trinity from the first and the third in the statement, my God, why have you forsaken me? And yet that was necessary. And so you have God running after Adam and saying, come out of the bushes. And then it says, and therefore now a man will rule over a woman, which I see as a lament, not a command. It's a statement of the tragedy of what will happen now that Adam and Eve have messed things up. They will live with hope in the coming Messiah, the seed born of the woman. They will re-engage in damage control, because now they put their hand to the plow. Otherwise, nature will take over, and you won't have space for your food. So you've got to control the thistles. And yes, you will die eventually, but there won't be a Messiah born unless you have babies first. And so then it says, Adam took the woman and called her Eve, because she would be the mother of all the living. And so everything is an expression of this unwillingness to accept what Adam and Eve had done. And the engagement on every level, all the way up into the Trinity, to undo what had been the result of what we know of as the fall. And so, yes, no, this tragedy is not the will of God. Look, from Jonathan Edwards on, or going back to Calvin, or Augustine, Boethius, and others, again and again, the attempt is made to tell us that it is spiritual and virtuous to learn to accept and to see behind everything some divine purpose. Well, that's not what you find in the declaration of the third chapter of Genesis, where it all starts.